And my background is actually originally in software engineering, and I've been slowly making my way down the stack and through distributed systems and networks and data center computing and all that sorts of things. So the notion of open source and as a principle and as an approach to software development is something that I've been very familiar with for many years. So it's very exciting to see this event, which is, I would say is yet another contribution of computing to the world, and that's part of what this is really about. That there are principles that have been developed that are going to have important impacts and meaning to the methods that we use in a variety of other venues, and whether it be they engineering or scientific or historical or social science or humanist activities or art. I think that we as a society have a lot to learn from the early experiments in open source, which now have gotten pretty mature. So UCSC is very excited to be hosting this meetup. As I understand it, the Open Source Science Initiative, which is a collaboration of NumFOCUS and IBM Research, was, it says here, announced at the SciPy conference in July 2022. So we have a very relatively young effort here, but it's something that we're very excited to be part of and of hosting this first meeting. So the initiative itself is bringing leading scientific and technology organizations together, including industry, startups, governments, funding bodies, labs, foundations, basically all entities that are interested in innovation and in elevating society and elevating society's knowledge and making advances in a number of directions. And universities, right? So we, of course, are a very important place in that. Baskin Engineering is celebrating its 25th anniversary. And Baskin Engineering is a place where open source has actually been part of the fabric of what we do since the beginning. Actually, even in years before Baskin Engineering was formed, we had a computer science department, one that actually is older than the computer science department at Berkeley. So that as I've been told, was a place where some of an early version of BSD was developed and supported. So very early on. And then, of course, in 2000, the genome browser was made available to the world. And actually, I would say more than the browser, but actually the human genome itself was open sourced. And so you can see that, we're not just talking about software, but also maybe wetware. And having that available to scientists around the world was a major, not only achievement, but also moment for humankind. That it was something that was not owned by any company. It was not controlled by any government, but it was something that we all shared. And that's led to a number of important breakthroughs. And to this day, we have more recently a system called Usher, which was the repository for the world's database of variants of the COVID-19, the SARS virus, and the genomes of that virus. And again, it's something that we have shared with the world so that we as a society across the globe can fight this virus. And then, of course, we have been home to the Center for Research in Open Source Software, which is really the only UC system, University of California System Research Center that is dedicated to promoting open source and serving as an incubator for research in both open source, but also in carrying research forward outside of the PhD student lab, let's say. So that's very exciting. And then, most recently, creating this open source program office at the university level to promote open source across the entire university, not just within engineering. So it's really exciting to be at the center of this movement. And it's, again, something that pervades all of our work. And you'll see that some of the panelists here represent some of that wide variety of work, whether it's software or it has to do with our DNA, literally, or even, at the end of the table, I'm looking at Jose and thinking about the movement around open hardware, right? So it's a concept that's going to be very, very impactful. So the panel today is going to be discussing that and sort of enunciating the breadth of ways in which open source as a concept can advance innovation and promote take-up of great new ideas. So I will sit there and listen to the panelists and hope you enjoy the conversation that comes from that. Thank you.
You have more introductory remarks?
So we have, I think, 3 slides for the presentations.
That's your first.
Sorry. So thank you, Alex, for those nice remarks. And I really, I'm super happy that the university and the School of Engineering is so supportive of open source and enables this, what I think is a huge potential for amplifying science. So I want to talk a little bit about the OSSCi, and we have like 2 other organizations that are supporting this event tonight. So I want to keep it relatively brief, but I also want to thank Alexei Krabrov, who's busy with the camera there, but he's also a panelist for the idea of this event. Thank you, Alexei, and thank you for coming up with the open source science concept and organization. I want to thank Tim Bonneman for helping organize and doing a fantastic job in actually, promoting this event. We got a record number of registrations, which is really nice. I want to thank Stefan Editi, the executive director of Cruz, and also the Copia OSSCi effort for helping making this event a reality. And then Elena Martinovskaya, who just started last Monday, basically, right, or last Monday. She is our newest hire, and she got thrown right into the ticket, and this is her first event. So thank you, Elena, for a great job. And I want to thank Scott Brandt for moderating this event. Scott and I have been working together for a long time. In fact, Scott is the reason why I'm here at UC Santa Cruz. He said, just drop by and see what our research group is doing. I'll never forget that phone conversation.
Come hang out for a while.
Yeah, and I did. And thank you for the panelists for participating. So the OSSCi is really the product of a realization that there are a number of fundamental gaps in the university that really are barriers for leveraging open source in UC research. And one is actually making the value of open source visible to the university. There is no such thing like we have for research, where we have research funding streams, we have track of all this. There's no such equivalent thing for open source. And when you look at actually open source projects, there are very much, often just like personal projects, because universities don't have really a way of supporting it. There are some exceptions. The second one is education of students to be productive in open source communities, and the third one is engagement with industry, government, and foundations leveraging open source. So the mission is to create programs and partnerships to promote open source literacy, to help students learn from open source communities, to enable scientists leverage open source to accelerate research efforts, and to connect students and scientists with stakeholders in open source communities spanning industry, government, and foundations. Right? These open source communities are not just hobbyists; they're everywhere, and so and they're very powerful. We have a number of programs that we designed as part of the OSSCI. The first one is the Open Source Research Experience, which is a yearly exchange for project ideas and is a matchmaker for mentors and summer students, leveraging outreach and funding programs like the Summer of Code. And this year we extended it by the Summer of Reproducibility, which is also NSF funded. Then we have the Open Source Incubator Fellowship, and we have Emily Lovell, who is one of the incubator fellows. The other one is traveling in Europe right now. These incubator fellows are postdocs that leverage and grow open source communities for products in their research agenda. And the fellowship really favors efforts with strong inclusivity aspects and high impact across multiple disciplines. And then the third program we have is the Open Source Education Program, and it includes teaching a class CSE 117, which is open source programming course. It actually teaches students on how to submit a Linux kernel patch. And it turns out that goal is basically all-inclusive. You have to learn a lot of things in order to do that successfully, but it has also the additional attraction for students to be actually recognized by those communities. We also provide summer workshops on open source topics, and then we have also working on innovative industry university partnerships for teaching open source at UC Santa Cruz. We are funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and this has been extremely, we're very honored by that, because we're like one of the first 6 universities in the country who actually are funded to create an OSSCI. The other ones are Johns Hopkins University, Rochester Institute for Technology, University of Vermont, CMU, and St. Louis University. They all have their different approaches, and that was basically the Sloan Foundation's goal. And so, we are basically, one of our goals is to not only do, or promote open source within UC Santa Cruz, but also create structures across the entire University of California system. And we just submitted a proposal to the Sloan Foundation that involved actually multiple campuses, including UC Davis, UCLA, UC San Diego, and UC Santa Barbara. And that's actually a sizable portion of the 10 campuses that we have, right? 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, and 3 national labs. We're already working with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and so it's really spreading, and it's really cool to meet all those people in different campuses that are very interested and enthusiastic to make this happen. We have also funding from the National Science Foundation, as I mentioned. So there's the new directorate from the National Science Foundation, which is called Technology and Technology. I forgot the I. Technology in
Innovation
Technology Innovation Partnerships. They have a program called Pathways to Open Source Ecosystems. So we got a phase 1 grant for that, for one of the projects that came out of the Cross Incubator. And then we have also, together with the University of Chicago, NYU Tandem, FAIR SRCN, that's a FAIR, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable open science research coordination network. It's like a huge acronym, but it's very exciting because it's actually, it's what's funding the summer reproducibility, the idea of being really invigorate the exchange of reproducibility artifacts that are being produced at conferences, but then also need people who are actually using them, and both in research labs and also in the classroom. So sorry that took so long, but that's basically the.
Hello, so my name is Carver. I'm Open Source Science Community Director at IBM Research, and I'm going to talk about two other partners. I will represent NumFOCUS, which is our community partner, and Open Source Science Initiative, which we co-founded together with NumFOCUS and IBM Research. So NumFOCUS, how many folks know about NumFOCUS? Right? How many folks know about Jupyter? Everybody, right? So this is very interesting. So NumFOCUS is the foundation which is a home of Jupyter, Pandas, NumPy, SciPy, scikit-learn, and other projects. And it's a sponsorship. It's not fiscal sponsorship, right? They have no development or plans for software. So it's basically an umbrella organization, right, for all of these projects, and it also now runs a PyData series of conferences, and SciPy conference from this year will also be run by NumFOCUS. And so IBM historically had a relationship, sponsorship of NumFOCUS, and was on its advisory council, and it was run by Watson. And recently, IBM Research basically inherited this relationship and strengthened that. And when we were thinking where do we want to home our open source science initiative, we naturally came to NumFOCUS as basically a convenient place for the data science projects. So I'll talk about both things, right? Because they interconnect. So when I joined IBM Research, first of all, I come from a very long history of community stewardship in the Bay Area and around the world. I run about 8 different meetups in the Bay Area, including Bay Area AI, programming languages meetups, big data meetups, and I also founded and run a conference called Scale by the Bay, which will be run for 10th year this year. It will be in October in person, probably in Fort Mason. So I invite everybody to check it out, and there will be a specific track focused on science. So when I was in these communities of practice, mostly startup engineers building companies big and small, right? I found that there is some very healthy dynamic of information exchange, which really powers this internet revolution. Right? If you look at why do we have the internet and AI as we have right now, you might argue that we have big data because of commodity data centers run on Linux. So Linux is a foundational waypoint here, and we have AI as we know it, and because data science projects and AI toolkits are open source software systems which were adopted by a majority of practitioners. So we actually own majority of advances to this culture, and companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, they're all now rising on open source. So that led to formation of Linux Foundation, and then in turn, the Linux Foundation powers projects which enable these companies to thrive. So something very significant is happening in the industry, and for some reason, academia is behind, right? And academics are very smart. Each individual researcher is doing cutting-edge research. However, if you look at the open source landscape underpinning this, there is a lot of impediments and it's behind for many reasons, and some of them are, first of all, misaligned incentives. So there are different funders who fund research, and it's geographically spread organizationally. There are governments, private and public partnerships, and also I think the kind of hierarchical nature of science publishing really did not foster this kind of exchange of open source software, because software is following the research goals. So what was happening in last few years, people who develop open source software for science, right, they basically a lot of them come from the industry background. And so they bring this dynamic of free information exchange into science. And what happens is, for instance, various AI techniques are generalizable across different disciplines, biology, chemistry, physics. But the researchers in these disciplines do not talk to each other, but the research software engineers helping them, they would kind of connect and find commonalities. And as open source becomes more widespread and legally a requirement to use public funding, what we see happening is that open source culture, including collaboration, information exchange, generalization, right, not repeating itself, is coming into science. So Open Source Science Initiative was formed to structure and enable this kind of healthy dynamics, right? So we want to bring the best practices of open source culture into science, and we do it in 3 ways. So first, we convene interest groups and verticals corresponding to disciplines. So IBM Research has focused on material science, climate science, and healthcare and biomedical research. So we have 3 groups which we stand up in these areas, and they're volunteer groups and meet monthly, right? Everybody's welcome to join them. Then we have cross-cutting concerns. First, we want to map all of science to open source used for science. So we have a Map of Science project, and some very interesting folks joined it. For instance, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative has a lot of work in bibliography, meta-research, and mapping of open source software in biomedical research. So we're partnering with those folks. So we invite everybody who can think of how to represent progress in science through open source, use for it, to join us there. We want to stand up a group on reproducibility, which is, again, a cross-cutting concern, and all threads come together in that area, because you need to essentially tie data sets, open source software, models which are derived by running software on these data sets, papers which talk about the models, graphs produced with these models, right, and citation graphs. So effectively, we kind of envision a scientific bundle, right? Eventually, we'll have to have standards, and these bundles will be deployed on different clouds. And IBM Research is developing a cloud platform for science, and Microsoft and Google address all things, right? So I think in the future, your GitHub repository will have a button, deploy this scientific project on Cloud X, and it should be able to reproduce your results, your graphs, your paper. I think we're going to the future where it will be very easy. That will also enable collaboration, right? These things can be done, developed together, papers written in the cloud, published, reviewed, right? And so cycle of scientific discovery will accelerate. And that's, the goal of Accelerated Discovery team at IBM. So our incentives are very much aligned. And we are really happy to partner with OSSCI and UCSC. I was very happy to meet Carlos and see what great work you guys are doing here, and I really appreciate UCSC hosting us here. So our plan for this year is to really look in the small. How does a university operate using open source? So we'd like to effectively do research on UCSC, right? Understand how open source tools are used here in different disciplines. What are the common points? What are the gaps? What are the needs? And hopefully we can generalize it further to UC system nearby, and hopefully then around the world, right? So that's kind of how we hope to collaborate with OSSCI and learn from each other. So we're really happy to be here. Yeah, I operate the machinery as well, so I have to adjust. But works on the Meetup organization, very lean operation. Make sure we have that.
Good to go?
Yeah, right.
Yep. All right. Well, with those introductory remarks, now we have a panel of people with bringing a variety of perspectives on open source and open science. I'll introduce myself and then I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves. I'm Scott Brandt. I am UC Associate Vice President or Associate Vice Provost, depends on, one's my working title, one's my real title, for research and innovation for the UC system. Technically, I work in Oakland, but actually I work about a quarter mile down the hill here where my house is. I'm also a longtime computer science professor here in the, now I guess I'm a computer science and engineering professor since the departments merged at UC Cruz. And my introduction to, of course, as a longtime computer scientist, I've dealt with open source software in many ways throughout my career, but my big introduction to it was through the Ceph storage system that Sage Weil developed. Sage was co-advised by Carlos and I, and was working on the system as his research project, and was a serial entrepreneur before he even came to us. And he said, when I'm done, I'm gonna turn this into a real product, an open source product. In fact, what he told us was that he wanted to be the Red Hat of storage. And then a few years later, Red Hat bought his company, and we spoke to him, and he said, well, I wanted to be the Red Hat of storage. Instead, I'm the storage of Red Hat. Close enough. So here we are. And that for me, was the real introduction to the world of open source and what kind of impact you can have that way. So I have some other thoughts, but I think I want to move to our panel. I'd like to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves and then start with some opening remarks, whatever thoughts you bring today that you want to share before we get into a larger discussion. So we'll just go down the line. So please, Juanita.
Okay, I'm Juanita Gomez. I am a PhD student here at the UCSC in the computer science department. But I am also the community manager for the Scientific Python project, which is an initiative to sort of coordinate the scientific Python libraries and develop tools that are useful for all of them. I actually joined the open source community like a few years ago when I was a developer for the Spider IDE project, and I started working on documentation and educational content, sort of like teaching people how to, well, in that time, sort of like how to use Spider for doing their own stuff. And then I got involved with the Scientific Python project, in which I started also doing content. In this case, sort of like to introduce people to the Scientific Python environment, ecosystem, and sort of like let them know how they can contribute, how they can join. And this is one of the important things that I can bring into discussion, because I'm very interested in sort of like this education and documentation on the open source community, that it's really important to onboard people to new projects and sort of like take this load off the maintainers, but sort of like move it somewhere else, like into, I guess, in this case, I would say universities. So yeah, that would be my discussion.
All right, Alexei.
I think I already introduced myself, so.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Carlos Malzahn, faculty at UC Santa Cruz, Department of Computer Science and Engineering. My background is storage systems, and I also in the last few years did a lot of reproducibility work. This actually, the entry into reproducibility was one of my students. I tend to accept students who are somewhat misfits. They don't quite fit into the sort of straight mold. And so this was a brilliant database student who was really interested in reproducibility. And he convinced me that that's something to be interested in. And he did actually a fantastic PhD thesis that showed that you can actually, using DevOps methods, you can really accelerate the scientific cycle. And it's this whole concept of software delivery, which is a very well-known term in DevOps, is actually can be also applied to science, and it's called research delivery. And research delivery is essentially you know, everything that the DevOps community did with software delivery, where you basically deliver software in a very portable way that's very reproducible, that you can, you know, reason over when something doesn't run, or it is much more likely to run in new environments. And the story hasn't ended yet. So there's, even in the software engineering community, is a significant amount of research going on right now that goes deeper and deeper into the tool chain to make this even more portable and more reproducible. So that's a very exciting new area that I sort of started in addition to, that I joined in addition to storage systems. As Scott mentioned, you know, I started here and was introduced to storage systems research with the Ceph project. It was actually kind of funny because Scott asked me to lead a summer project to put together all the research that has been published before and create a big journal paper. So that was my summer job when I started here. And I don't think I was even paid yet, or maybe I was already paid or something. It was like one of those things to get my hands dirty in academia. I was, before I started at UC Santa Cruz, I was at NetApp, a performance engineer. And I basically, you know, at the end, there was Sage Weil, who was starting to implement a new storage system. And we needed a name. And so I came up with Ceph, because it was somewhat related to slug. and so, you know, I didn't want to call a storage system a slug, but Ceph was somewhat more parallel, right? Lots of arms and parallel, so that fit better. So anyways, based on Sage's success, one of what Sage said when he, you know, sold the company to Red Hat, his startup to Red Hat, which was called InkTank. And he said he wanted to have a structure in the university that would enable other students to have a similar career as he had. Meaning that students should be able to, first of all, be very literate in open source, understand the opportunities, what open source can actually do for them, and then also have the opportunity to continue that work after they graduated. And that's actually the idea that then turned into CROSS, the Center for Research in Open Source Software, where we introduced this concept of an open source incubator that that then allowed students, you know, postdocs, to grow a contributor community around their research product. And that's what Sage did, but he was already independently wealthy, so he didn't need funding, right? But he did basically that, and then started a startup, and the rest is history. So, and we did that in 2015. We created CROSS, and we're wildly successful. But we had also some really important lessons from that, and I will not further talk about this because that's, you know, later. But fast forward to 2022, CROSS became somewhat famous, and we were approached by the OSSCI community they basically told us, you know, you guys actually created an OSSCI in academia, and we're looking actually for models on how to do that. And we said, no, we're not an OSSCI, we're just CROSS, right? And so then we realized that there were some differences, and so then we put in a proposal to Sloan Foundation, and they helped us to further really, you know, make it really sharp, and we got actually the OSSCI out of that. And so we're very happy to have that, and that's why we actually have an event like this today. So thank you.
Okay, I have to do a follow-up after that. At the very beginning of the introductions, there was a little talk about the variety of representation we have here, and I am from that startup representation. My name is Xander. I founded a company called ByteWax, and it's a Python framework for stream processing. Before that, I was a data scientist at GitHub and Heroku, so I've always been kind of close to the developer tools and how people interact with them and open source. Yeah, part of the reason why I'm here today is to get exposure to how the intersection between academia and industry and commercialization of open source projects can all come out of this relationship. Yeah, a little bit more about me. I live in Santa Cruz. My wife is starting to do her PhD at UCSC next year, and I'm really excited for her. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Great. Sorry for being a bit disheveled. I've just come from lecturing twice actually in succession, so I'm a bit anyway. So I'm Benedict Payton. I'm an associate professor in biomolecular engineering. My background is genomics, as Alex was alluding to earlier, and UCSC's sort of long contribution to that space. Genomics is this interesting place in which biology has met computer science over the last 20 years, because biology is inexorably going through this transition of being, from being a cottage industry in which each lab did its own little tiny experiments where all the data could be displayed in a spreadsheet, to being a discipline in which we produce petabytes of data in contemporary data sets. So my lab has sort of sat between computer science and straight biology for a long time, and we developed platforms for the NIH, for Chan Zuckerberg, for others, for hosting those data sets. So we build the NHGRI's, so National Human Genome Research Institute's Anvil cloud platform. This is with the Broad Institute. We build the Human Cell Atlas data coordination platform with Chan Zuckerberg, and also with Broad with the European Bioinformatics Institute. And a number of other projects really built around this concept of open source, open data for a small, although still tens of thousands, community of biomedical researchers who need to have access to large amounts of compute and really large amounts of data. And then on the flip side of that, my lab does a lot of methods development. And for me, without open source, it's sort of, I wouldn't be in academia. I wouldn't be creating methods if I couldn't release them and have them, have broad applicability. And I think one of the reasons why our department at the university really punches above its weight is because, yes, we develop things, but then thousands, actually tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people use the UCC browser, use the tools that we develop, and go on and make discoveries, and things get cited thousands or tens of thousands of times. So for me, that culture of openness, which has always been part of genomics ever since I've been part of it, is foundational to what we do. And if we didn't have that, if we were all kind of proprietary, keeping things up our sleeves and not releasing them, we would be very much poorer, and the genome would not be open. So yeah, I'm very glad to be here.
So my name is Jose Renal. I'm a professor of computer science and engineering. So when did I start open source? So this was 30 years ago. So I was doing commits on the Linux kernel at the time. And I didn't think about open source or anything. It was just cool as an undergrad student. I like to do that. So fast forward to when I started to be a faculty. So I like that part of the contribution to the community. In a way, it's like publishing a paper gets accepted, but it's different. There was no pull request at the time on GitHub. But I think it's a similar thing. You get the contribution, you see the contribution outside. So since then, I've been, as my faculty life, like doing both things. So I've been trying to, how to accelerate the hardware design, because it's more like hardware design, how to improve productivity and things like that. But there is the concept of the tools, and there is the concept of the papers. And I understand that the students need, in industry, might have a little more more tools, but in some area they want to academia, more paper side. So there is a balance between them. It's a difficult balance to have, but I've been trying to keep that balance all the time. And sometimes the projects come very surprising, like I have 3 active open source projects now, but one of them started as a class project. And then I went to do consulting on a company, and they use it internally. And then they started to evolve, and then they open source into Chips Alliance. And now it's open source. Now the PhD students are doing contribution back and forth, and there's several places that it's being used. So it's a little bit, and I totally didn't expect that to start as a class project, bring it into the startup, and then start to be involved inside there with people professionally working for that. And some other projects, it was more like an evolution of performance modeling. So you never know what is going to come on those projects.
Okay, thank you all. So now I want to just get into a bit of a discussion about some of the topics related to open source and open science and the university and industry and how we can do better. How can we promote the development of open source projects and open science projects? How can we promote the sustainability of these projects? As we know, many projects get started. Not very many projects actually bridge the gap between prototype and widespread use, in part because there's a huge amount of work involved in taking a, let's say, a university prototype piece of software that can answer a few research questions for us and getting to the point where other people can actually use it reliably. And so the question I just want to put out there is, what can we do to make open source and open science more feasible? Really, from my perspective, that's the issue, is that we get things started. We don't, in some sense, finish them from a commercial perspective to the point where others can use them effectively, unless they know you. I know there are some domains, like in the telescope domain, that our folks that work on telescopes, everybody in that community knows each other. They all have, maybe there's 3 telescopes that use the same hardware. Somebody develops some software, they're motivated to share it with their friends, it gets used. But there's a big gap between that and, I don't know, how long did Sage work on Ceph before it really took off? 7 years?
7 years after you graduated.
That's what I thought, yeah, 7 years after his PhD.
Very large open source community.
Yeah, okay.
So many people, like it's not something that's just like, I mean,
Exactly, and so.
CI systems in place, community, developer meetings.
Exactly, and so I was thinking about open source, and I also, in my role at the UC Office of the President, and also when I was Vice Chancellor for Research here, I oversaw innovation and entrepreneurship. And if you think about innovation and entrepreneurship, there's a well-oiled machine for taking prototype ideas, getting people initial funding, getting them later funding to build out their products, and then eventually there's the path forward. There's a success path for them that is extremely well developed. And there's a couple ways that somebody can be successful with their innovative idea. One is they create a product and it happens to take over the world, like maybe a solid state memory, or they sell themselves, the company gets bought by a large company that incorporates that into their product line and it gets out that way. Open source is different in some sense. We don't have that machine for carrying these projects forward. And so I want us to think about and maybe opine a bit on how we can develop that system so that all of these good projects, and we know there are many, many of them, can have a path forward that people can see and follow to get those projects out there into widespread use. So I'd like to invite whoever wants to comment on that too.
So for me, from an academic point of view, one thing that it clearly can be improved is the reward system. And let me give you an example. So I have an open source project that is a performance modeling. I did that from at the end of my PhD, and then I've been maintaining since then. So it's the thing that has my most citations. No? So in theory, I have a lot of citations for it. But when I do my merit reviews, it's not a new publication. So it doesn't count as anything. So I keep maintaining it, it keeps giving more citations, keep being used. My merit reviews is pointless. So the reward system on that is like, as an example, it does not exist. Now from that, I can have like projects that they get papers out of it, and then through the papers and I get the citations and it gets the benefits and everything, but there is really no benefit from trying to maintain that thing at all, or try to have external users from outside. So that's a reward system that is clearly flawed.
So do the papers on them? I mean, because my experience has been the papers on some open source.
So usually when you do a merit review, you might increase citations, and maybe you can have a sentence say, oh, my H index increased that, but I don't have any publication.
Yeah.
So that doesn't count really much. That's like, well, at least he's not dead. At least he's not dead, he's alive and breathing, this kind of thing. It doesn't count as much.
The papers and such.
No, they're getting extra, they don't have an extra new publications. Having extra citations on a previous paper, you don't even mention those things on the merit reviews.
If I can recommend something here. So, when I joined this ecosystem of scientific open source, I found that, there are organizations which are far ahead. For instance, NASA, right? NASA has this open source science initiative as well. And they because they're far ahead because all the data is public, right? And we don't have impediments. They, I think, tackle this problem. And I think, including NASA folks, there is a journal of open source software, JOS. So the model is every time you update your software, every time you issue a 0.1 version, you write a new paper. It's a one-page paper, which summarizes the changes which you introduced, which may be a lot of work, and then you said it.
With archive, you can do that. Maybe
Yeah.
a little trick you can do is like every 2 years, I'll create a new archive version of the paper, and then to get the citations
That's
there.
not
Oh, I have a new archive.
I mean, that's a hack, right? That's a workaround. It's
a
an
hack.
antiquated publishing system to try to reward behavior rather than rewarding the.
I mean, it's as if
incentive.
academics can't evaluate things without a number, right? I mean, I just don't understand this idea that academics can't evaluate the quality of work by looking at it. You have to have a publication that's cited, right? It's strange.
Yeah,
For
so,
educated people, I would think.
yeah, so we have to, I mean, this is a well-known problem, right? So there's actually a large community is thinking about software citations, right? And some of these people we're in direct contact. So Dan Katz, for instance, is someone who's like, really very famous for that work and for also the communities, and he's sort of created for looking at that. And I think that's a really good step. But I think there's also more to it. So I think, there's the career path for professors, right? But then there's also the career path for students. And one thing that happens very often is students have a brilliant idea. And let's say they use an existing open source project, or they create a new open source project, and they use that to, publish a paper because of the experimental results that they generate on this prototype, right? In more recent years, more conferences are actually demanding reproducibility artifacts, and they reward them. There are like 17 computer science conferences that have actually yearly reproducibility awards. There are separate programs, separate reviews of reproducibility artifacts. And so it becomes even more valuable to have actually these prototypes. But then there's this point where the industry reads these papers and they want to actually use that stuff. And that's where things break down, right? Because it's then usually the student who has to maintain this. And this means there needs to be documentation. There needs to be onboarding, what you mentioned, right? There needs to be testing. There needs to be a lot of things that is actually not in the job description of a student, especially a PhD student, right? They are supposed to defend a thesis. They are supposed to research. That's becoming, there's like a real fork in the road of making an open source project successful and making the PhD students successful. And so, and I see the story happening again and again. And then you have these orphan projects, which are excellent projects, but the leader is gone. The leader being the PhD student. And these projects die. And it's a really bad situation because somebody else could take over that project, but you don't know whether the leader wants to come back, right? And the leader is the authority. So it's essentially that project is held hostage if it's sort of a project that is always only maintained by that leader. And if you don't have an infrastructure that actually hands off, if you will, this project to a staff or some kind of structure in the university that then creates that open source ecosystem, right? And the NSF has recognized this and created this POST program, which is Pathways to Open Source Ecosystems. And it's interesting because that is a funding that explicitly excludes students. It does not fund students because they want to encourage that other infrastructure in the university that takes essentially this responsibility from students away of maintaining that software and have students actually focus on research. And so that's the thing that I think is a fantastic new innovation because it actually creates funding for staff. Mm-hmm. And if you look at how does the staff look like, right? It's
research software engineers. And there is actually also a large community that thinks about research software engineering. And some communities have this well established. So HPC has a strong research software engineering community. There are, what they called, there are these HPC applications. Some of them are highly protected because they're national, national security issues. But these people are responsible, and you see this also in applied math departments. They are responsible for a particular application, and they are leading that open source project, right? And some of it is less open source because of national security issues, but some of them are very open source. And we have some of them here at UC Santa Cruz too.
How do you, sorry to interrupt, how do you determine which get funded in that scenario? So a project is created, which has some intrinsic motivation to create a project, and incentives are aligned, and then maintenance becomes a burden.
Yeah.
And then this takes over. And how do you determine which project should, or this governing body?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I think the National Science Foundation currently is learning that.
Yeah.
And so they are, we are now part of the cohort, but they have basically they want to fund projects that have, where a little bit of money, right, will have a huge impact. It's sort of getting you over the threshold, right? And it's a 3-year phase 2 project, as they call it, right? So they give you a phase 1 funding for a year that basically scopes out and allows you to figure out the market and the community for this particular open source project. And then the phase 2 is giving you actually a significant amount of money for staff to really create that infrastructure. And so what I hope will happen is that university will start to have this staff, and then you can share the staff. This is the beauty of open source, right? It's not like a startup, like an incubator, where you have to be very secret and you have to strictly separate teams for each startup, right? Because they might compete with each other. In open source, you have the maintainer that can actually maintain multiple open source projects as a job, right? Because there are no conflicts, right? There's only time. That's the resource. And so there's the agencies that are now actually actively trying to learn how to select those projects, right? But there's also the other side, which is what our experience at Cruz was, that we got a lot of research funding from industry. And industry, they kind of start earlier. They want to actually see the research. So the research comes first, but then they love the idea of having that research products available as open source as standardization blueprints. And that's especially true for industries like the component makers, like disk drives and flash drives. That industry is a very low margin industry. They can't really afford to have their own research labs, but they're very dependent on standards, and they kind of want to drive new standards because that drives innovation. And they're really relying on universities to do that. And they, and they're also very scared that when they actually come up with a standard, that somebody is like having these patents that destroy standards. So everybody agrees on a standard, but then one company says, I got you because you have to now pay me because I have a patent on this standard that everyone agreed to. And so everybody has to pay that company to follow that standard. That's a nightmare for everyone, right? But having the university as a place where you develop these blueprints for standards, these reference implementations, and maybe even the university has the patents, is a much more trustworthy situation for industry, as I learned, than if it's like some company, right? And so it's almost like a patent pool implementation. So I think there is a huge amount of innovation possible, and how the university can play a role in various industries, how in helping research flow into standards via this open source way.
Also, sort of like helping students or whoever is like creating these packages know what to do, right? Because I guess it would be sort of useful to have some sort of a guide of how do you become from being a new open source project to a funded, well, like structured project. Like if there's this, I don't know, like a step guide where it's like, okay, you've reached this point, now next point is like, you need to find funding, but to get funding, then you need these and these and this. But I guess this is something that might be a problem, as in where you get to a point where you develop like this amazing package and it's like, okay, now what do I do? Like, what's next? And sort of like having, I don't know, maybe people that have already gone through this process and like create, I guess, documentation on how to get to the point where I have a structured library that has funding and has developers and it's actually maintained. It's also like something that universities can give support to, because yeah, the education on how to get there. It's like
Totally agree. Yeah, and I think that's I think should be taught in undergraduate classes. It should not be the job of PhD students, right?
Yeah,
and I think
this is exactly where in the innovation and entrepreneurship space, the venture capitalists step in and they say, here's a financial person, here's a business person, you know, here's somebody that'll help you make a business plan, et cetera, and they'll hold your hand because they stand to make a bunch of money if you're successful. And this is exactly where I think that the open source and open science community needs to fill that gap. That's our own valley of death, is that these great ideas come out, it gets to a certain point, and then you know, our brilliant young people do have to eat. And we don't have a roadmap for success in this space. There are some models, but for instance, Sage happened to already be wealthy because of his previous successes. And so he was able to invest a whole lot more time into Ceph, but not everybody has that opportunity. Or in our genomics space, they happened to develop something at exactly the right moment that was extraordinarily useful. And so instantly became Santa Cruz, and that group instantly became famous and extremely well known. The timing was absolutely perfect. Actually, 3 days is how much we beat the next closest team that was sequencing the human genome by. 3 days. And that was the difference between the human genome being open and it being patented by a company. And so we got lucky. Not everybody can be independently wealthy or that lucky. And we need to find a model and a way so that people can move forward with these projects. I think one way to do that is to have a closer relationship between industry and the universities, for example, because industry benefits fabulously from these projects when we manage to get them across that divide. And I think that a greater partnership can help. Please go ahead.
So there's another area that I'm wondering about, and I heard a common point that was across about documentation. And the All-in Open Source project, which is working on diversity and inclusion in open source, has been doing a whole maintainer listening tour, talking to hundreds of maintainers, lots of surveys, and documentation is the #1 barrier to entry for everybody. No matter what your background is, no matter what your coming to this experience is, the documentation is always the problem. And as a doc expert myself, you do have to maintain documentation. I mean, it's not just you can just dump it and let it go. But so what I'm wondering about is models like the Teaching Open Source organization has been working on a model of having projects work with students to have the students working directly in the project. But when I was in the Fedora project, for example, when I was leading the documentation effort, we worked with a group of students at a university, and it was their first year, second semester writing course. They all had to write a marketing copy for part of our release notes. Because they had a bunch of questions that were interviewed to the technical person that they could use to write something from, and we put it on the wiki and blah blah blah. Like it was very hands-on. Like the teacher had to really dig in and so forth. Just this idea of what the things we can do from within the system that are, because I heard somebody else saying about bringing it down to the graduate level, right? We just can't be having this stuff always be maintained level. And that's the problem in the industry as well, is that your software developers, they've just got, the people who created the thing have enough time to get the basics there of what the doc needs to be, but you just can't, you get a choice. You get to move the thing forward or write what we've done. You're not have to be working. So I'm curious what the experience to think about that.
I have good news for you. This all will be done by ChatGPT. So, I mean, seriously, what's really interesting, right? So this is hard work, documentation, tests, continuous delivery. This is all the best practices that we know in industry, which are extremely hard to do in university because researchers are not professional software engineers. They, then disinclined to do this mostly. They don't have the time. So I want to kind of hit 2 points. So one is, first of all, the landscape of funding is changing. So the POSE is one of the things, but I want to mention another one, and then Kat also had a hand in that. So Research Software Alliance that he co-founded, it had a meeting in Amsterdam last year, and we started drafting what we call Amsterdam Declaration on Sustainable Research Software. And so the point there, and so the meeting was attended by, heads of funding agencies of nations and multinational organizations, such as OECD or kind of European agencies, and they're basically writing grants for research. And now a lot of grants include software. And so what was happening, if you develop, if you do cancer drug research, as a part of this, you develop a lot of software, it often turns, to what we call abandonware, right? The students move on, professors change universities, you have an old tarball flotilla in front of it from the 90s, it doesn't open, doesn't run, right? So there is no incentive for students or professors to do this because there were never incentives to do this. So what we want to do with Amsterdam declarations, first of all, declare that sustainable research software is a necessary result of any funding which goes into research, including software. And there are principles which explain what it is. For instance, it should have a community, right? You cannot have sustainable software without a community as a principle. As a recommendation, then you can have that in order to have a community, you have to have a community manager. So previously, scientists do not write community managers into grants, and if they do, the agencies which fund them will not approve it. So what this will do, first of all, it will encourage the agencies to ask for proposals, right? It will encourage people to actually provision community managers. So that should change culture. And also, the declaration starts with a very key point that research software engineers are as important for research as the research scientists. Right, because I think one of the key problems of academia is that structurally, because software engineers were added later, there's actually no good home for them, right? So they are, unless like the people who develop open source for brain studies are lower in this hierarchy than people who make sure your mouse works, right? Because people who make sure the mouse works for students, they make students happy, which is the utility function of the university. Students are the customers. And so the value chain basically currently does not reward software engineers who support open source projects across the university. And I encountered that at NumFOCUS, so I met the project named ZAR. So that's a large file format. And now it was adopted by every electronic microscopy maker, right? So basically they sell multi-million-dollar machines. They drop their proprietary formats, they use ZAR. For many years, the founder of ZAR was basically at the University of Dundee, one of these research software engineers fighting for funding for many years. And so now they got funding from CZI, right? So this is, to me, it's really enraging, like how this person who selflessly maintains for many, many years, key part of international scientific infrastructure was not rewarded through UK national institutions, through any kind of public partnership. So why was he languishing there and had to fight for this, and manufacturers were not encouraged to support him? So I think with the legal change at the top, it may be easier, right? This should be propagated through policy. And now, as soon as these bodies will start funding these roles should be elevated within universities. Another thing, OSSCI. OSSCI is a very unusual thing. I was really surprised to learn from the inaugural OSSCI conference that they don't know where to put an OSSCI in university. There is nothing connecting universities. So they put it in the library because the only other thing which connects universities is the library. So the head of Carnegie Mellon OSSCI was the head of Johns Hopkins library system. So universities are really not set up for something which is spanning the whole of university and finding network effects. which is crucial for open source software, right? So I think as we kind of bring this open source software culture, universities will have to adapt. They have to create prosperity concerns. They have to create rewards for research software engineers and use this public funding to enable them, to help everybody else. And I wonder, how, like in biology, how would you use these roles? How would you integrate them, for instance?
Yeah, a couple of comments. So I very much agree with Jose's comment earlier in your comment about universities. The UC is a good example of not valuing research scientists, non-tenure track faculty in general, and particularly people who are interested in doing software engineering, but not necessarily wanting to become a professor and not wanting to deal with people the whole day. I think that we have to think very carefully about how we reward within the university. We don't necessarily have the best financial incentives, but we have other ways of trying to incentivize people, and we think very carefully about that. I think and something that hasn't been mentioned, but I just want to mention very quickly. For me, good open source software is often quite small, and there's a modularity and a size factor in good software that is often missed. People tend, when they start to create things, to build big monoliths, and then they go off and it gets abandoned. Yeah, there's a KCDs about this. Whereas good software tends to be small, and it solves a very specific problem, and does it well, and everybody uses it, and it's easy to incorporate, it's easy to build, and all the rest of it. So I think thinking about and educating people about how to build actually useful software, and it's very back to basics thing, is actually extremely important and often missing in a research context, right? We often over-engineer, and we often build for specificity and don't think at all about reusability at all, right, at any point, which is a problem. In biology, I will say that NIH, perhaps being the largest funder in the country, right, does dedicate a significant amount of funding to what we call resources. Now, those resources have traditionally been large biological databases, so people who are holding data rather than programs. But increasingly, they recognize that they have to fund software engineering to build, and maintain the tooling around those. And traditionally, that's been the preserve of things like the National Center for Biocomputing and so forth, rather like a national centralized thing. But increasingly, there is a sort of recognition that that funding has to be better distributed. And I think there are opportunities for universities to think about how they can leverage that growth in open source software in domains like biology, where there is a lot of funding in it. Our whole industry, the whole of biotech runs on academic software in that space. There really is no proprietary software that anybody's using at any scale. It's all open source. So both for the economy, but also for universities, I think there's an opportunity there.
On NSF, there is some, also for infrastructure, there are some CRI infrastructure grants that are specifically called for software. And they exclude research, so that's the thing. So you have to be very clear, it's software, but you cannot have research. You cannot mix both, because they tend to open once or twice a year. So I got one of them. The only thing is that they tend to, for example, the last one I have under review is I won a professional software program. And in the small grant, that it was just one person, it was not possible to fit there. So I have to go to a medium size, because really there's no way to pay a person with that. Yeah. So then it gets a little bit tricky on that. So, but there is some potential funded source. So for example, how do I maintain my software project? As many master students as I can, those are perfect. Because what happens with the master students, they are not necessarily doing research, they are doing infrastructure, they learn the thing, they go to the industry, they got familiar with the flows and things like that. It's a very good training for them, and they build infrastructure for them. The problem tends to be is that they tend to get the thing working up to 80, 90%, and then they leave. So they have to be part of a flow that someone else picks up after. They are good for pruning and try things or clean up some little things, but not really to bring up, because they're not going to finish that. It's going to work 80%, no documentation. And, but at least it helps you to do something. So the PhD students, you can use them quite a bit, but you don't want to. And one of the first things I always ask, do you want to go to industry or do you want to go to academia? And then the projects are totally different. So if they want to work to industry, it's okay to work on those things, because industry appreciates. But if they want to go to academia, forget it. You're not going to get a faculty professor position. So you sort of look a little bit ahead and you ask them what you want to do. They take usually 1 year or more to graduate, which again, on the merit reviews, they always give me complaints. Oh, your PhD students take too long. Not because they are a lot of infrastructure in my project. What can I say? And then the professional programs really help, but those are difficult to get a hold on because they cover the budget.
Yeah.
The typical budget allocated for that is like, you need $1 million for 4 years. Otherwise, you cannot put the overheads and everything there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I think there is a huge opportunity to, there needs to be sort of a very targeted campaign towards industry, right, that they can really help here. And one thing that actually we ran into, we had a very promising, we still have a very promising project that came out of the incubator from Cruz, right? And we had like all the component makers saw this, like, this is the blueprint for the future of computational storage. And they told us that. And it's like, so when is it ready? Like in 1 year, 2 years, right? And it's like, well, the student who's working on it right now in the process of putting together an advancement. And then, we're looking at maybe like 2 or 3 years on actually getting a defense. And then there's a research prototype. And then we're looking at maybe 6 or 7 years to have it actually to maturity, right? And they said, forget it. Just might as well just said, we're not going to do it, right? Because it's just too far out in the usual university career path, right? So there is an opportunity though to say, okay, the concepts are there. Now let's build a community. Let's have research software engineers that are funded by a mixture of government and industry. And not only working on this project, but on a number of projects that have that need. And then really change things, right? So you have actually, and some of them, I'm right now working on a project with Lawrence Livermore, and they have some of those research software engineers, and they're like fantastically productive. It's just unbelievable what they get done. And they do fantastic things about, they can actually they know how to package software. They make, they can create reproducibility artifacts for papers, but they can also create the ecosystem that a software project needs to actually, get more contributors. Alex.
I was just going to say that, it's just that I would say software, but maybe the industry and the entry barrier into open source is really it's a show me sort of thing, right? It's not you have an idea and now we will build a community. It's you have a thing and now we'll build the community because you've already shown me that this thing is useful. And so I'm trying to think about what other discipline maybe in academia builds artifacts as the end product of the research. I'm thinking of astronomers or instrument builders or, maybe
it's music department, arts.
Music department, yeah, right. So, maybe it's just that, in computing, we have this tradition of computer science, which has this kind of attenuated or particular concept of what a contribution is. But maybe there are other disciplines where the contribution is the thing that you build, like music, like art. Maybe that's the analogy. That's what we need to evolve to.
I like that a lot. Because I mean, some things like I keep hearing this OSSci thing, and I don't know a single maintainer of community open source projects that would want a job like that. I mean, it sounds like I might as well go to industry and make money if I'm gonna like be someone. Academic freedom. I don't want to someone to tell me, here's a project you work on this week. Now here's a new project another faculty has. Your job is to take the code, clean it up, add documentation, infrastructure. most of the people in the community have like real passion and ideas about what they're building. They're changing the world. It's a small group of people, and many of them, were in tenure track positions and lost out because it wasn't recognized. And it's like some of the most important software. It's critical for national infrastructure. Our research projects are, space exploration. And so I think if there's some way to think about, it's not like every single software program needs to be a faculty. I can think of one.
This is an excellent analogy, and there are disciplines in which the artifact that you produce is the product of your research. It's not the paper you publish about it; it's the thing itself. And then, in the arts, you might get reviews, or even actually the book that you produce in some disciplines. And the book is the thing. It's not necessarily the contents; it's how well received the book itself is.
Or the exhibit.
Or the exhibit,
Or the
exactly.
performance.
And so it's maybe a change in mindset about the value of the product that we're producing. The artifact is not just the thinking behind it. I think, let's say this was your point earlier as well, that we need to value the creation of these products in the same way that we value other academic products.
I think this is the very center of open science, is what you're saying, which is, and that's where I work in open science, and the overlap between open science and open source infrastructures are really critical, actually, right at this very moment. But as I mentioned to a couple of you, the Biden administration has declared the year of open science. NASA's leading the charge, NIH is on board, NSF is on board. All the other agencies must follow these new policies. And the policies are not just that all articles should be published open access, it's that all the data sets should be made available. This is huge, it's radical, and it's different, and they're going to track it and they're going to enforce it. So all of a sudden, we're going to get a huge tidal wave of open data. And nobody said anything about code, but there's sort of mention and rumbling that code that also goes along with the data.
You have to, so that people can interpret the data.
Well, right. So, but that isn't yet written in the policies, but some of us are advocating. So, but there are no best practices for any of this. The repositories are all over the map, for all the different disciplines and everything like that. A lot of researchers don't know how to use them. A lot of data ends up in things like supplemental materials with the article, or available on request, or it's on my university server. And open infrastructure is going to be critical so that all of this can be made available to people who need it in perpetuity on open infrastructures that are supported by the academy. And a lot of data sets already out there are on proprietary and commercial platforms right now, locked, sometimes even increasingly behind paywalls. You've got the large commercial publishers like Elsevier looking at how to monetize that data right now. And they're saying, we did it
on the other company.
We did it with all the articles. Now let's do it with the data sets and everything else that comes out, and code. And so we've actually, I agree that industry needs to be involved in the funding dilemma, but this has to be a public investment of government funding implemented through institutions, because otherwise we will get, our data will be eaten.
I'll tell you, I think they punted on the hard part. Storing the data and keeping the data around is the easy part. Storing the programs to read that data and actually access that data, and making the data itself accessible by making sure those programs exist in perpetuity, that's the hard part. So Carlos and I have done some work with the national labs, and they save everything. And they said that storing is no problem, because every year the storage capacity goes up faster than they can produce data, or at least usably produce and access the data. But storing the programs is the hard part, in part because the computers that ran those programs don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so now you have a real problem, because you've got the data, big deal. You can't do anything with it.
Yeah.
Even if you know the format, you have to start from scratch and write new software to access it. And so we had, oh, I'm sorry, quick comment, and then we had a question.
I want to jump back one step, so Ben wants to jump back.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to, with this concept of an artifact, we have this, I mean, it's not just an open source thing. I've been doing software development for decades. There's maintenance, right?
Yes.
So to me, I'm a community person, so everything that's like a community to me. So I think in the open source world, I mean, it just doesn't scale, but like you can do the central infrastructure of all these projects. I really think you need like minimal viable community. In other words, it's like, and also like this documentation piece is really critical But the guy who's the researcher that comes with a great idea and writes the code, he's not interested in doing that. I mean, in industry, we have technical writers. I mean, there's different disciplines. You shouldn't expect this one person to do all these things. But if you have a community that's passionate about the project, there'll be people in that community that do like to write. There'll be people who do like to do tests. So I really think that should be the goal, is not to.
Yeah, we actually, you know, the great School of Engineering did a really fantastic job of hiring people who actually release news, right? And so and that's a really nice thing. It's like, I mean, basically doing the PR for the research that happens at the university. That's not actually that different from, you know, what we're talking about here.
So I think instead of the shared engineers, I think you could have the shared community manager type people, people that are good at community that can come in. And if you're good at community, I mean, I like to think I am, you know, you don't do everything. You actually empower the community to run it. It's like
I think we're maintainers. That's what they do. I think you spend more time.
Yeah. So I think an investment in professional community builders that can actually build these minimal viable community. Because once there's a flywheel effect. Once they get going, they can maintain themselves with very little like overhead.
Yeah, but getting over that threshold is the hard part.
Yeah.
So I want to go back a step to what Alex was saying before, but about these different pieces. There's Carlos mentioned one of the OSPOs that got formed out of the Sloan Foundation is actually not an OSPO. I'll get off a little. It's the Open Works Office at Rochester Institute of Technology. And that's because Stephen Jacobs is in a multidisciplinary school where they've got open science, open design, open art. I mean, the Magic Studio, it's a great place. They're making games, they're doing all these things. So he wanted to make sure everybody felt welcome with that. So there's this Open Works definition, which it basically provides exactly what we're talking about in a sense. And there's the deal with a definition or a license or any of these things when it comes to communities, like there's the legal protections and all that stuff. Then there's also the mythos around it. Any of you might have heard that recently the big company Wizards of the Coast, owned by Hasbro, has been seen messing around with the open gaming license in the D&D communities, right? And the license, who cares what it says legally? What its purpose did originally was you all have permission to just go do things. Don't worry about it. Get together and make things happen. That's what open source gives us. The open gaming license gave that. So there's a cultural aspect as well as like another aspect of this. So having these definitions, making sure that when we say open, we all mean open it follows some rough similar definition, and all those pieces are part of it. So I just wanted to throw that one in that Open Works is a thing that's out there, and that would be a way of, RITs. Yeah, I'll get you a second question. Sure.
Thank you. Well, we have a few more minutes if anybody wants to offer some closing thoughts.
There were a couple.
Oh, there's some online questions?
Yeah.
Not any concrete questions. I can maybe read a couple comments.
It's okay. No, there was one about a sustainability question.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is from John, who's joining us online, and he was to the sustainability question. It seems only a tiny fraction of open source projects become truly open, as in having a vibrant community of contributors beyond the original developers. Are there any particular practices that would enable this transition? Actually, that might be a nice kind of wrap up.
So I can tell you what I do. So for example, in my case, what I do, I don't have a single project in which there is a single contributor of my students. So, and the students that tend to be extremely bad, that they like to have their own fork, and I don't allow them to fork. If I can destroy the fork option from GitHub, I'll do it. I don't allow them to fork, I don't allow them to branch, because they never commit, they never push. So they are always committed on main, and the code reviews, they are not there, but if they were good quality, I will do it. But they commit to the main branch, and they're supposed to commit frequently. And in every project, they have to have several people working. If you have only one student, what happens is that the student graduates, is gone, and it's like in the industry, you have only one single contributor to the code. No one is going to come pick up and grab this thing unless it was extremely good programming, which is extremely unlikely. So what's going to happen is going to be a mess. No one understands what's going on there. So you need to have several people, several students working on that. That's what the master students tend to help the things, and they keep pushing and pulling, and maybe there's one PhD or two PhD students working. And I do a lot of code commits too and reviews of the code. That's one way to at least to clean up the code and to make sure that there is some maintenance, because maybe there's like a couple of years that the student graduates nothing, but then there's a new PhD student and picking up, and then they start to evolve the project again. And because it's not a mess and everything's in the same membrane, they can pick it up and evolve it.
Yeah, I just want to add something. So BioX is an open source project, and we're a commercial open source software company. And I've spent a lot of, it's a very young project. It's only 1 year old. And I've spent a lot of time looking at what we need to achieve in terms of certain metrics to determine whether or not the project is viable beyond being an open source project that fits into some need within the community. And the things that we look at are external contributors and number of stars, which may sound like a vanity metric, but it's really about the awareness of the project. And then the external contributors show if there's need from people outside of yourselves to use that software, and they're willing to put in time. You have two ways to measure how much someone needs or likes your software. One is a mouse, or one input for measurement is the mouse, and the other is a keyboard. And the keyboard is a much more valuable unit of measurement because someone is actually taking the time to make a change to your code. And so I think I wanted to say something earlier about the projects inside the university. It feels to me like external contribution as early as possible is the most likely way to have success in some of these projects. And so external contribution can be within different domains within the university, or within different universities, or within industry. But it seems like you'll be able to determine whether or not there's an actual need for your software at a very young, early phase. And then you can go out and get funding. In the venture space for commercial open source software, there's a lot of research into when someone achieves a certain number of metrics, then it's like a viable project. So if you're going for your Series A, which might be your second round of funding, you should have over 2,000 stars and 14 external contributors, and that's like a metric for success, and you'll be able to achieve that flywheel. Mostly what comes along with that is like a sufficient community, and you've built a community, you've gone from 0 to 1. And so I think there's probably some things from the venture world and commercial open source software that could be leveraged within university, because it's the same concept of you're creating this software, you want to determine whether you should fund it in perpetuity, fund that maintenance, which is a burden. And so you can use that same methodology.
So this is actually, I love hearing this, because this is sort of the goal, right? If we can get to that, if we can get some of these projects to that point, then suddenly the world becomes interested in that. There is a long path to that, right? And so we, in our incubator, in Cross Incubator, we came up with this idea that postdocs cannot just work on their product and grow this community out of empty space, right? They need to have some kind of support on how to do that. And we realized that there are a lot of undergraduate students who are desperately looking for projects. They're desperately looking for good mentors.
One project for them.
Yeah, so there you go. And so that's actually how our open source research experience evolved. It's essentially a way for people who want to grow communities around research products to seed their communities. And it starts with undergraduate students who are looking for good mentors and a good project, right? And so that's just one little step, right? But then the next step is, and actually the side effect is exactly what Jose is mentioning is, if that product is suddenly exposed to these students, they have to make sure that they can actually understand the code.
Yeah.
Right. And they have to actually create this whole community management for all the students that are now starting to work with their code. And that's a very healthy pressure for those projects. And so that we got a lot of benefit from that, but it's only the first step, right? There's a next step where a lot more needs to happen before you get to 2,000 stars and 14 outside contributors.
Yeah.
But I think on that note, I guess the way in which these external contributor think can work and like involving undergrad students on projects is if we improve the developer experience, sort of like the onboarding experience, because it's very hard for a person, like an external person that doesn't know anything about a package, to just jump in and make a first PR. Like this first PR is the hardest part, and it's because there's not enough resources or like tools to get this person on board to the project. Yes, so I love what you're doing, like teaching open source to students, because that's like the first step of like making the developer experience easier for them to like jump onto a project. So
there's a lot of good examples in industry, open source, in outside of research. Like I was working at Google and like with the community manager for Kubernetes. And like they have a really good onboarding process for people to become contributors to Kubernetes. There's a lot of examples out there that you could learn from.
Yeah, that's why our first class that we developed was with a Linux. Although in hindsight, it's maybe, I mean, they have a very old process, right? It doesn't use GitHub. It uses a mail, it's like terminal mail, right? That's like the key part of it. But it also, I mean, it teaches students to really learn that tool chain, which has also its benefits, right? But it's a big project and they have huge amount of infrastructure put in, so that when you actually expose the project to a class of newbies, they don't even, it doesn't even.
Right, that's what I'm saying, like you have the technical documentation of the code itself, but then there's a whole separate class of documentation, which is onboarding documentation.
Exactly.
For readers.
The Kubernetes community success at onboarding and inclusively is not by accident.
Right.
People who
I know the lady from
well, I know you
Google.
do, right? I just want to let everyone else in the room know that the people who started that community, many of whom come from other communities, OpenStack, MySQL, have been 10, 20 years of experience. A lot of times, one of the other challenges we have is everybody knows how to do the thing through the pain over time. Every once in a while, we write it down, but then nobody else knows about it. So I go out and I talk to people all the time, and they're doing all the things that I've known how to do. They do it better, and they all figured it out from scratch, just like I did. So
you know, like Google started with the summer of code, and then they went to season docs to realize documentation is important. What I'm saying is a pattern here. Of course, I'm a community guy, so you have a hammer, everything's like a nail. You know, I think it's like this community element. It's like, I don't know what it's called, the something of community. Like I think there needs to be like a focus.
Develop that.
Yeah, there you go.
Develop that.
The spring.
Yeah. No, I think that there's like, I think, I mean, you know, we have to realize in universities, right, that these community people are highly paid resources in industry, right, for a reason. And they develop really powerful communities around these products. And think about, you know, if we had similar resources at the university that would develop these communities around important research.
I like it. All right, well, we've hit our time. And this has been a really excellent discussion. I'm really grateful to everybody. Thank you to everybody who came here. Thank you to everybody who joined us online. And especially thanks a lot to our panelists for this great.